All right, session number 2. I've been reading again. This time I came across a book in the library. Let me just find the title again. I'm woefully unprepared for this. Here we are. It is The YouTube Online Video and Participatory Culture by multiple Gene Burgess, Joshua Green, Henry Jenkins, and John Hartley from 2009. I skipped straight to the penultimate chapter because it had the most interesting title, I thought. It was a chapter by Henry Jenkins and titled What Happened Before YouTube, which appealed to me in terms of connecting YouTube to cinema language. So I have just finished reading this. Sorry, I'm skipping through lots of screens on my computer. I have just finished reading through this, and I've got a few thoughts straight off the bat about it. It was really interesting, and I think the biggest thing I've taken away from it to begin with is the idea that YouTube is not necessarily doing anything new. Right at the top of the chapter, Jenkins put a couple of quotes about what has happened in the past and what predictions people have made before YouTube about the democratization of video. And Jenkins starts their paragraph, their chapter, by writing that all writing on YouTube seems to have the assumption that it is setting a precedent, that it is an unprecedented technology and that nothing like it has come before. Jenkins then goes on to actually refute that and to give plenty of examples, which we'll delve into in a moment. But the thing that I took from that sentence particularly was my own assumptions that YouTube was creating a language, a new media language, or was adapting on the history of film language. Perhaps it's not. And that should be an important part of my research. If I really want to say YouTube is developing a new language, then I need to find something very specific. I need to know my film language very thoroughly, and I need to be able to point at some tropes or trends or uses of video in YouTube that just don't exist in cinema or in anything previously, even in video. A major part of Jenkins' argument is the use of, or the community of vidders from the, I guess, late 80s, early 90s, communities of people who would use video technology to create mashups, parodies, musical tributes, I guess you could call them. They seem quite a sensitive culture from their favorite TV shows. Star Trek was one example, exploring characters in very much a slash fiction kind of way. A Kirk Spock romantic musical montage, for example, was one thing listed there. The idea that people were doing things that we sort of say that's a bit YouTube-y back in the 90s suggests that actually YouTube isn't creating much new in the way of language at all. But there's a great area for delving into and seeing actually if it is, because I still feel like this is a topic worth pursuing. I feel like YouTube is still a particularly fresh channel of media language, and there are new ideas and new methods coming from that. I would say the vast numbers of people involved in it would be part of the reason why YouTube is more likely to have new things to say in terms of media language than something like the vidding community of previous decades. That said, there is another point much later in this chapter about those vast numbers, and it is a point circling around the idea that YouTube perhaps isn't that democratizing. There are 2 points here, actually. So the first is that YouTube perhaps isn't that democratizing because although it has given access to production to much more of a wider demographic, one writer that was quoted, I didn't take the name actually, but one writer that was quoted said just a quick skim over the top 100 videos shows a much less diverse and global view than the actual mainstream media. Which was kind of worrying. I do have to preface this that this book was compiled a little while ago. It's not completely up to date. The date of publication, or at least the year, would be 2009. So it's about 11 years old at this point. So actually that things might have changed in terms of diversity at this point, but that's probably worth exploring as well. If I'm to conduct a PhD on this topic, then I should make sure I have things like diversity and articles like this one checked for the modern era, and do my own brief bits of research into the facts that I'm talking about. If they're this old, a quick skim of the top 100 videos might show a much more diverse picture than it did 11 years ago. That will be something that's very easy for me to do, and therefore essential for me to do. Another factor that came off there, so the second point of that point I was making about the democratization, is that although many people are able to use YouTube, it does require that those people have the facilities to do so. They come from the right educational and economic background, that they have their own personal access to YouTube. They are not using YouTube through public computers where video upload is a little bit more tricky and difficult and not as private. You can't go into a library and start vlogging, because people are going to ask questions and get in your way and probably ask you to stop talking. Again, though, this article being 11 years old probably doesn't take into account the proliferation of smartphone technology or of the sheer amount of lightweight laptops with webcams these days. It's more widespread than it used to be. It still definitely is missing in some communities. And one possible area of active research of an actual activity to do on this would be to go out into a community, or to find a community within my local area of people who don't have access, and to give them access and see what comes of that. What kind of content will be created? What kind of tropes will exist in their minds if they don't have regular access to YouTube? How will they use video and media language when they haven't previously come from a background where that's something that exists in their everyday life? That seems a little bit maybe problematic and anthropological. And I'm thinking about a particular case. I think either it was one of my own lecturers at Newcastle, or it was someone that we read about from one of them who took a camera to a community, I think in Algeria, to see what they would make. Yeah, it couldn't have been one of my lecturers. One of my lecturers was vastly interested in Algerian cinema, but the result I'm thinking of came out in the 60s. So yeah, I didn't meet that person. That said, it's possibly straying away from my area of focus, but it would be an interesting experiment, really, to see how a community that doesn't have access suddenly engages with access, and to think about the conventions of the content they create in terms of media language. How would that answer any of the questions I have? I've made a few notes from the reading as well. There are other things to mention here. The idea that YouTube has given ground to many more voices saying many different things was also refuted by Jenkins in this somewhat. The idea that YouTube suddenly enabled people with niche issues like third wave feminism, or with a particular interest in a very particular TV program, or people that have a problem they wish to talk about within their local community and want a wider audience to hear about. These were not ideas that were unique to YouTube. These were not new things at the time of the launch of YouTube. These were things that were existing in different media for many, many years beforehand. Jenkins is able to trace this back through the vidas, through early internet culture, through zine publishing, self-published magazines or pamphlets distributed for an issue, and in fact goes right back into the 1800s with the idea of self-publishing ideas for slightly more niche topics than the actual journalistic or media superpowers, as it were, are able to or want to divest to the public. That also links to this idea, and it's an idea that I had originally thought of when I came up with this idea for a topic that, and now I'm questioning a little bit, and it was linking the idea of YouTube to Garagebands, particularly the punk movement in music. The idea that suddenly everyone's garage space became a place for rehearsal and producing music. It was no longer a pursuit of the elite, of the wealthy. The musical instruments were very accessible, and a punk band didn't need that greater musical education. You could just learn a couple of chords and bang away on some drums and get something out there, and that was fine. And YouTube for a while was deemed to be the next version of that, the video version of that. Everyone's garage suddenly becomes a TV studio, and in many cases we've seen that that's happened. Many amateur producers are just doing it. But the idea that is in this article is that actually it's not that, it's different to that, because whereas a band might have a particular scope for where their music's going to go, it's going to reach their local community, it's not going to go much further unless they're particularly lucky. They're not expecting a record deal, they're just doing it and for themselves, essentially. YouTube seems to have that innate sense of it's going on the web and I'm going to get followers and people are going to see this. But YouTube is actually it's a media source that's curated by a larger company. It's not a public company, it's a private company, and therefore actually uploading your video from your garage to YouTube isn't quite the same as just saying, this is for my community, it's just for me. No, it's got an invested sense of maybe this is going to get big, but it's only going to get big if that private company deems it worthwhile. Again, thinking about the time gap here, we're a much more aware culture now of what Jenkins in this article calls an information culture, but actually an information economy. But actually now we would probably start using the word attention. It's an attention economy. There are algorithms at work to keep us invested in the content we want to see, and it creates these bubbles of interest, which mean that alternate media probably isn't going to get the exposure that the original utopian dream of YouTube suggested. You're not uploading your video to the world. You're uploading your video to a small group of people who already have some kind of vested interest in the topic you're talking about. It's a slightly worrying angle on that. I'm not sure how I'm going to relate that to language, to be perfectly honest, but I think that is an interesting point. It's very easy to talk about YouTube as a democratized media, but that's not necessarily true, and should be something that any author talking about YouTube is wary of. It's a media source. It's not a traditional media source, and it does have a bit more freedom for the type of content that's uploaded to it. But in terms of reaching audiences, it is very much going through a gatekeeper. And we can't pretend otherwise. We can't pretend that we're all shouting to the world when in fact we're shouting to a very small section of people that probably live near us and we already know. There was one word that popped up in the article. This is totally tangential now. Machinima or Machinima. I've never actually heard anyone say that word out loud. I'm yet to actually research that. I was supposed to do that before I started recording. From the top of my head, that is digital recordings or digital edits of existing media. But generally, the way I've experienced it from video gaming, the way I usually associate it is particularly with the Machinima channel, and it's usually video game engines that have been used to create movies using characters from video games. It's like 3D rendering with an engine that already exists. Not sure where that lies in terms of copyright. In terms of language, that's incredibly useful because we're seeing a format that doesn't necessarily use cinema language at all. The video game industry, I mean, there are obvious exceptions to that. There are games which are incredibly cinematic to the detriment of gameplay in some cases. And there are games which have fantastic levels of gameplay and in fact include cinematic ideals. The way you perceive things, or the way things are framed, or the way things are presented to you as an audience comes straight from cinema. But Machinima I'm sticking with that pronunciation now until I've learned different. That takes a format where any game, regardless of its cinematic language in the game itself, they take that game and put it into a cinematic context. They create narrative with the items that were in the game itself. Game in particular, I know I have seen a fair bit of this, and is Team Fortress 2. Valve, the publisher of this game, actually do a bit of this themselves. Like Team Fortress 2 does have a lot of narrative movies, I guess you would call them, short films, using the characters that just give a bit of context essentially to the game. The game itself is a multiplayer team shooter essentially, and there's very little narrative in the actual gameplay. There is no story mode. You just go in and you're capturing a flag, or it's a death match, and that's it. That's it. There is a red team and a blue team, and each team takes out the opposing team and meets the winning conditions. That's the game. So these little films that Valve make alongside it kind of just give it a bit more context, a lot of humor. But the Machinima side of it goes a step further. It doesn't have these pre-rendered animations that Valve are putting out, but it in fact uses the game engine itself. These characters and these environments are from within the actual game, but they've been modded heavily and edited and voiced, and narratives are created that are not from the original publisher. They are not canon, essentially, but they do follow cinematic convention. They have a lot of montage. They have particular shot distance, which I would say definitely obeys the tropes of cinema, and they follow cross-cutting. You will often have parallel storylines. So there's an idea here where YouTube content creators are using a non-cinematic format to create cinematic content, but through YouTube, which is quite exciting. So Machinima is something I really need to read a bit more about. I think this is a very interesting area of exploration, and I should think probably the area in which I'll find out whether or not YouTube has any original language in it, because these people are content creators on YouTube using cinema language. So both things get to exist, but at some point, hopefully, we're going to see in one of these creations a moment where, oh, that is not something any film director would do. That seems weird. Why have they done that? Because it probably exists on YouTube somewhere. It's probably a meme, like we discussed in the last video. That would be really interesting. I've got a couple of books to look up. Jamming the Media from '97 by Branwyn, and I can't read my own handwriting. It's pretty terrible. Real Histories, spelled with a double E, because book puns are great. It's a history of amateur filmmaking by Zimmerman in '95. These are two things I want to look up, but they sound very relevant to me. My own ideas coming off the stuff that Jenkins discussed. Pinpointing the new language is the most important, finding exactly if YouTube has a new language or not. The musical analog, the idea of Garagebands and punk. One thing that I did think off the back of that was the distortion that appears in both of those places. Punk music and later homemade electronic music, any form of music really. You kind of get this celebration of distortion in those things now. This ironic sense of like, we're cheaply made, we're reveling in distortion. It's not a bad sound. This is a sound we intended. And YouTube creators are using this too. And again, I'm going back to Davey504 now. Davey504 has a lot of edits in his video, which are the same shot you just saw, but blown up and distorted. It's a distortion of image that would never happen in cinema, because it absolutely shines a light on the medium itself. And I would argue that that's why musicians are using distortion too. So distortion is possibly one area of language that I could pinpoint as, if not YouTube specific, then amateur video specific. Some reading there that I think that Zimmerman text will be really helpful in identifying there. And I think it makes it fair to make that musical link after all. Another thing to look into is the Witness group, apparently created by Peter Gabriel, with the idea of media that portrays violence, unfairness, or anything in society which needs to be highlighted to wider society and people made aware of. And this group collates that and distributes it essentially. And it started well back in the 80s. But the idea that Witness have a demanding message, they want you to see their video and understand from their video, this is wrong. And this was in the article. This person, Jenkins, sorry, I keep forgetting the name. Jenkins did talk about Witness and talked about how they are able to, or they want to make sure that the message is taken from their video, that people aren't seeing a video on YouTube now and thinking, oh, look, that was funny. That guy got beat up. I liked it. No, they want people to see a guy getting beat up and acting, becoming active, saying, that's wrong. I want to act against that. So Witness has a central space where they keep videos of that nature. I believe on their own website. That's something for me to go look up. So you go there and you know what you're seeing. You know that these are videos that are causing you to activate. But if it's on its own website, it's creating a sense that only the people who already are active are engaging with it. So they need to drip feed out onto YouTube, and then YouTube creates this problem of decontextualizing or recontextualizing. And how can media language help us avoid that? That would be a really worthy area of study, I think. How can media language force context? How can it stop you seeing just a random CCTV clip of a shop being robbed and instantly give you the context that this happened in this place and that was wrong and we need to do something about it, rather than, oh, look, that shop got robbed and oh, that shopkeeper was probably asking for it because they had a gun, or oh, America, that doesn't matter, or I don't know, like any context you can possibly draw. Maybe the robber's mask was funny. This is a comedy video. Whatever context you can draw from the video other than this is wrong and we need to activate on it. How can we use media language to establish that? And I think at 20 odd minutes, we'll leave it there for today. Cheers.